see everybody here. By the way, I forgot to say in the announcements, Happy Father's Day. How could I forget that? So all the fathers out there, Happy Father's Day to you. All those who have been benefited by fathers, Happy Father's Day to you. It's a good day to honor fathers and all that they do. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the communion message that I will give in a moment. But for now, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 14. So if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 14, we will be picking up in our study of the life of Christ. As you probably know, we are basically just going verse by verse through the New Testament here on Sunday mornings. And we're going through the book of Matthew. We're traveling a little bit more slowly than I thought we would, but you know, there's just so much good stuff in these different stories that we find in Jesus' life. You almost hate to go too fast through them. But we find ourselves in Matthew 14, and last week we finished up Matthew 13, which was a period when Jesus spoke in a lot of parables and teachings. Jesus had given these 7 parables about the kingdom. Remember, we're sticking with this theme that Matthew has of Christ as the King. And as the King, we have the privilege of listening to him speak about his kingdom. And in very illustrative ways, very useful ways through these parables that we went through. But as we mentioned before, there's a certain pattern in the book of Matthew where you have extensive teachings by Jesus followed up by miracles of Jesus. And so throughout the book of Matthew, you have this pattern of Jesus teaching with authority and then Jesus backing it up with miracles of authority. And we're going to find that in chapter 14 of Matthew this morning. As a matter of fact, we're even going to see how the response was of Herod, who was the tetrarch of Galilee. He was also over Perea. He also had received word about all these miracles that Jesus had been performing. And that's going to be the first story that we come across here in chapter 14. So let's just read the first 2 verses there. This is Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 1. It says, "At that time, Herod the tetrarch heard the news about Jesus and said to his servants, 'This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him.'" All right, so this is Herod the tetrarch. Now, don't get this Herod confused with the Herod that killed all the babies in Bethlehem. That was Herod the Great, and this is his son, Herod Antipas, is kind of what he was called. And he was a tetrarch. See, after Herod the Great had died, that region had been divided into 4 different parts. You had Herod Antipas, who took over part of it. Herod Archelaus, who took over another part. Philip, who was also one of their brothers, took over a part. And then even Salome, the sister of Herod, not to be confused with the person we're going to talk about in a little bit, she had a part for just a very brief moment, and then hers kind of got assimilated into the others. So Herod the Great's little region got divided up, and these brothers kind of took over the area. And Herod Antipas, which is the one that's being spoken about here, was over the region, as mentioned before, of Galilee and Perea. Remember, we're studying Jesus' ministry, or Matthew is focusing on Jesus' ministry in Galilee at this time. And so Herod hears about this man who's doing these wonderful miraculous powers and demonstrating these great miraculous powers. And he says to his servants, "This is John the Baptist." That was one of the things that was being said about Jesus that was being circulated. Some were saying that he was some type of prophet, maybe he was Elijah. Others were saying that he was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Well, Herod goes with John the Baptist. That's what he thinks Jesus, or who Jesus is. And we might think, well, why did he think that? Why would Herod accept the fact that this was John the Baptist? If you remember, you look back on the life of John the Baptist, and in his ministry, you don't really see him doing any miracles. That's one of the unique things about John the Baptist. Even though he was so successful, even though he spoke with such authority, he really brought repentance to Israel and paved the way for the Messiah. He did it all without miracles, as far as we know. And so why would Herod think, okay, I hear about miraculous powers, and then all of a sudden connect that to John the Baptist? Logically, it doesn't necessarily make sense. But fortunately, we have the rest of the story. Now we'll have the rest of the story. And as we continue to read, we'll see why it was that perhaps Herod was influenced to accept this idea that Jesus was actually John the Baptist raised from the dead. So let's continue the story in verse 3. It says, "For when Herod had John arrested, he bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. For John had been saying to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.'" So this was a big to-do in Israel at the time. The National Enquirer would have had this on the front page. This was kind of a big deal. Herod had divorced his wife, Phasaelus, who was the daughter of a king, King Aretas. And Aretas was over the region of Natasha. You don't have to remember all that, but just remember that she was a very influential political person that he was married to his first wife. And because of that, back then you married people to create bonds between other people that you might be in conflict with. Well, he divorces her. And not only does he divorce her, he then marries his brother Philip's wife. So Philip was his half-brother, and his half-brother had this woman Herodias, and he takes his wife and marries her. And John the Baptist, being the man that he was, he definitely wasn't the type of person to back down and telling people what he thought, especially when it came to immorality. He told him that that was not right. And this had very, of course, deep moral implications. But we find out later that this actually ruined Herod, or caused a lot of problems for Herod later on, because this king Aretas, whose daughter he had divorced, this actually leads up to a great war between them two. They're on the border of Perea, and Herod actually ends up losing that war. So this actually has a lot of historical things to it as well, and had a lot of things that worked against Herod in a lot of different ways. But for now, we just find that John the Baptist is telling him, no, this isn't morally right. You shouldn't have your brother's wife. Under Jewish law, the only way you could have your brother's wife was if your brother died. And you only did that so that you could carry on his name. But it didn't work out that way in Herod's case. And so Herod wants to put him to death. Now, if you cross-reference Mark chapter 6, matter of fact, let me just turn there just so that we can read from it. In Mark chapter 6, we find that Herod didn't necessarily want to put John the Baptist to death in and of himself. He actually kind of warmed up to this John. It says in verse 19 of Mark 6, Herodias had a grudge against him. Herodias being Herod's wife, the previous wife of his brother Philip. Anyways, she had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death and could not do so. For Herod was afraid of John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. And when he heard him, he was very perplexed, but he used to enjoy listening to him. So we find this a lot. You find this with Paul and Agrippa and different places in the book of Acts, where these major leaders and things like that, they wouldn't really accept the message of Christianity, but they kind of like listening to it. I don't know if they just enjoyed, remember, who was it? I think it was Felix, who said, almost you persuaded me to be a Christian. They liked listening to it, but they didn't quite grasp it and hold on to it. And that seemed to be what happened with Herod. He liked listening to John, but he didn't really accept the message that he was giving, apparently. But it was his wife, Herodias, who was kind of being antagonistic against John the Baptist in this way. And so that sets up the stage for what will happen in the future, as we continue on in the story. In verse 5 it says, although Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd because they regarded John as a prophet. So he wanted to put him to death, most likely because his wife wanted to put him to death and to keep his wife happy. But he also knew that the crowd would probably have an uprising if he did it, because everyone accepted John as a prophet, or most people accepted him as a prophet. And then it gives a story of how this all came about. How is it that John the Baptist ended up being put to death? In verse 6, but when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Now, this daughter of Herodias, according to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian from the 1st century, this daughter of Herodias was called Salome. And not to be confused with Herod the Great's sister, Salome, this was a different one. So whenever you get with the Herods, everybody seems to have the same name, so it gets a little confusing. But this is a different one. And apparently she was called forth to dance before Herod. It's his birthday, everybody's drinking, they're having a good time, and Herodias' daughter comes in and apparently dances in a very sensual, erotic way that pleases Herod in the way that she does it. Matter of fact, this whole story has been kind of the influence of a lot of art and things like that. She becomes kind of the poster child for sensuality and things like that. It had a lot of influence on the art world moving forward in history. But this is the story. And Herod sees this and is pleased. It says in verse 7, so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. So, make matters worse, he makes this oath, this promise, and it's a very ill-advised oath or promise, as we'll see. Now, if you go and cross-reference the book of Esther, there's a lot of similarities between the book of Esther and this story. With Esther, you remember King Ahasuerus, he wanted Vashti to come out so he could display her beauty, and she refused to do it. She actually does the opposite of what Salome does here. She refuses not to be an object of lust and sensuality, and he ends up banishing her from being queen or being in his presence, right? And then that's how Queen Esther comes to have the position that she has. And then this promise about giving everything that he has or giving her whatever she wants. You remember then King Ahasuerus had made that promise to Esther. When Esther came, risked her life, no one was to come in the presence of the king if they were not summoned. Unless he held out his scepter, they would be put to death. But instead of putting her to death, he said, hey, I'll give you anything you want up to half of my kingdom. So there's some similarities between the two. One is an example of good women, virtuous women, women who would do what is right even in light of adversity. And then here we have women who were out for selfish means and actually helped the men indulge in their sensuality. So you can see a contrast between these two stories. But anyways, this is what he says. Hey, I'll give you anything that you ask. You know, you can just see him boasting in front of everybody else. You know, I'm this powerful, influential person, and I'll give you whatever you want. Well, in verse 8 it says, having been prompted by her mother, she said, give me here on the platter the head of John the Baptist. So her mom had already thought ahead. Herodias had already told her daughter, hey, if it gets brought up, this is what I want you to ask. John the Baptist's head on a platter. And then in verse 9, although he was grieved, that is, Herod was grieved that she had made this request, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests. So after making this bold proclamation in front of everybody, yeah, I'll give you whatever you want, you know, good job. Well, he was too ashamed to say, well, everything except for that. So because of the fact that he made this oath, the fact that everybody was kind of watching what he would do, he went ahead and had John the Baptist beheaded. And in verse 10 it says, he sent and had John beheaded in the prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. His disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and they went and reported it to Jesus. So now we have, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. This is why King Herod, most likely is why King Herod assumed that that Jesus was actually John the Baptist, raised from the dead, doing these miraculous powers. And you get the idea that it's because of the guilt that he felt for having John beheaded. Which gives us a moment to pause and really think about guilt. Think about the burden that guilt places on our hearts. I don't know if you've ever done anything that has caused guilt in your heart. I think all of us have done things that we wish we'd rather we didn't do. Or maybe you can think of somebody else who had a guilt-ridden heart. And it's interesting how psychologically you react to guilt. Sometimes you respond the same way that that Herod did here. That is, you see everything through the lens of your guilt. Anytime anyone mentions anything closely related to whatever it was that you did, you feel guilty on the inside. Maybe you become defensive, or you just assume that they're talking about you. I didn't steal that money, or I didn't do that. We didn't even mention you. You weren't even brought up in the conversation. You kind of get this guilty complex, and you begin to think through your whole life through the lens of this guilt. And guilt can kind of just weigh on your subconscious, maybe even sometimes in your consciousness, and can become a great burden in your life. You know, some of the worst feelings and emotions that we have to deal with as humans is one, fear, another, anxiety, another, depression, a very heavy thing that can weigh on our hearts and on our minds and can affect really the way that we think about everything, the way we view the world around us, the situations we get in. It really does taint our glasses, our life glasses in which we see everything. Which can make us, as we think about guilt, appreciate what we have through Jesus Christ. You know, all of us were prompted to come to Jesus because of guilt. We realized there were things that we did in our lives that we regretted. God had said this, and we did that. God said not to do this, and we went ahead and did that. We violated his commandments. We did things we knew that were wrong. At the time we did it, we knew it was wrong. Because of our guilty consciences afterwards, we knew that it was wrong. God has placed in our hearts a very valuable thing, a conscience. When Adam and Eve partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they immediately knew right from wrong. And in connection to that, they knew that they were naked. And they also felt guilt. They felt shame. All of those things that's connected to violating God's commandments. That was kind of the beginning of it all. And now the conscience does help us to navigate, to know what is right and wrong. But as we all know, we don't follow our conscience a lot of times. A lot of times we go against our conscience. And that creates guilt. But through Jesus Christ, and putting our faith in Jesus Christ and being connected to him, we can have our conscience and our guilt taken away. We might have to still deal with the consequences. Doesn't mean that all of our problems get washed away, but at least we don't have to deal with those problems and then also bear the burden of a guilty conscience. So let's praise God today that we can be freed from our conscience through Jesus Christ, from guilt through Jesus Christ. But there's something else we can get from this as well. And that is, we can kind of follow how it is that Herod came to acquire this guilty conscience. It kind of starts in progression. And isn't that how sin often gets manifested in our lives? It's usually started through a progression. It started out with something very innocent. His birthday. Herod's birthday came. Nothing wrong with the birthday. He's there. He wants to enjoy his birthday with other people. But when the birthday came, it wasn't balloons. It wasn't a moon jump. It wasn't a birthday cake that was there. It was debauchery, sensuality, drinking, and just everything else that you can think of that took place in this party. And so Herod began to slip and began to fall into this trap that led to this guilty conscience because he put himself in a bad environment. He put himself in a bad environment. He had his friends around him, this party, this debauchery that was going on, and that led him to sin, which is a good thing for us to learn from. We got to be very careful what type of environments we put ourselves in. Oftentimes we may think too well of ourselves. We might think, well, I can go to this or I can go to that. I'm a Christian. You know, I got God on my side. He'll protect me. I won't fall into this sin or that sin. And the next thing we know, we slip a little bit more. We slip a little bit more. We compromise over here. And before we know it, we're doing things that we never would have dreamed of doing before, which then leads us to a guilty conscience and dealing with things perhaps years after that instance takes place. So we got to be careful. Business parties that maybe we go to that seem very innocent can turn into something very badly. Bachelor parties. It's amazing how many Christians would actually participate in bachelor parties thinking, oh, it's just a tradition. It's just one more wild night before the person gets married and has to commit himself to a woman. It's just a tradition. But think about the destructive things that can happen in just one night, as we see with Herod here on his birthday. We have to be very, very careful. Also, the movies that we watch, TV shows that we watch, the internet sites that we go to also create an environment that can lure us to do things that we wouldn't normally and typically do. We got to be able to avert ourselves from those different things, lest we fall into the same problems that Herod had in his fall here. So when we think about ourselves, we have to basically put ourselves in a bubble. That's what they teach us in foster care. Put the child in a bubble. protect the child from everything. Go above and beyond to keep the child safe. And that's what we need to do for ourselves, to protect ourselves spiritually. Put yourself in a bubble. Go above and beyond to keep yourself from slipping a little bit over here, compromising over there. Just do what you have to do to protect yourself. Don't put yourself in situations that will cause you to slip. The other thing that kind of messed him up was he made a foolish oath. He made promises that he would regret later on. Be very careful, especially if it's in connection to someone who is immoral or doesn't have the type of standards that you have, and you go making oaths and promises to people. Just be very careful that you don't promise too much, and that you're very careful. With a genie, you got to be very careful what you wish for, they would say. You got to be very precise in what you're saying. Same thing is true when you make oaths. He made a very blatant oath without thinking about the details, without thoroughly thinking through what it was that she might ask for, and ended up being disastrous. And so here we see this progression. Started out with just a birthday party, put in alcohol and all these other sorts of things, sensuality, dancing, and all that, and it led to a mighty man, a prophet, a man of God, having his head cut off and put on a platter. You just never know what your little, seemingly innocent decisions will lead to in the end. We got to be careful with that. But there might be something else we can consider in this, maybe taking a step back and looking at it more broadly, because some might ask this challenging question. They might ask, why is it that God allowed this to happen in the first place? Why did God allow John the Baptist to be beheaded? You would think, wow, this is a man who's serving the Lord. He's bringing a whole nation just about into repentance. He's been proclaiming the kingdom of heaven is at hand. People are coming to the Lord. They're being baptized by him. A great movement had been taking place because of John the Baptist. He'd done great things for the Lord. And yet, to have this tragedy happen in his life, how is it that God could have allowed this to happen? And of course, the scriptures don't tell us, and this happened because God wanted to do this. But we can see, based upon what came out of it, maybe some reasons why God allowed it to happen. This is Joey speaking, it's my opinion, an idea, that perhaps John the Baptist, God allowed this to happen because the attention needed to turn now from John the Baptist to Jesus. Up to this point, there were followers of John the Baptist and there were the followers of Jesus. And sometimes those disciples of John would cross over to become disciples of Jesus, but there were still people who were hanging around John the Baptist, and their whole lives were about John the Baptist, and that's all they listened to. They heard John the Baptist, I'm sure, testify about Jesus as the Messiah, but they were still hanging out with him. It wasn't until John the Baptist would be killed and put out of the way that those disciples of John the Baptist would then turn to Jesus. And we'll actually see that as we continue on in the story. And this would be a way in which God could allow John the Baptist not just to die in some peril or some sickness or something like that, but to die in a noble way. He died proclaiming righteousness. He died in a very noble and prestigious way for doing what is right. And forever he'll be remembered as standing up for God's law, standing up for God's morality, and he'll bear the fruits of that good decision for eternity. So for a brief moment, yeah, he's beheaded, but for eternity now, he'll be blessed for the great things that he did for the kingdom of heaven. And so it could be, I'm just saying it could be that John the Baptist God allowed John the Baptist to be beheaded so that the attention could now turn to Christ. John himself said, I must decrease, but he must increase. And this is him being decreased to the utmost, so that then Christ can dig roots into those people who had already come to repentance and begin to establish his kingdom here on the earth. So it could have been a great move by God to allow that to happen. But whatever case it may be, however that may have came about, this is what happened. And it says in verse 12, as we read, his disciples came and took away the body and buried it. And they went and reported it to Jesus. So the disciples of John the Baptist went and took his body, buried him, and then they went to Jesus. Which is an example for us as well. When tragedy comes, when our loved ones perhaps die, when people that we care about leave us or whatever, when tragedy comes into our lives, let's report it to Jesus. Report it to Jesus. Take it to him in prayer. We need to take our burdens, our trials, our difficulties that we bear in this life, and just take it to him. Taking it to Jesus is a little bit, or is more valuable and profitable than even bringing it to our friends, because it's Jesus who really knows what we're going through. He's the one that really understands the trials that we're going through. And when we take it to him, sometimes just taking it to him gives us some relief and some comfort. But then we also know that he has the power to come and work in a very influential way to help us through those trials and difficulties. But we need to report things to Jesus as they did here. But again, already we see the disciples of John now making their way to Jesus. So now we see how Jesus' powers, his miracles, influence things even in a political way, in a very highly political way. Now we're going to see actually some examples of his miraculous powers. And the first one we come across here in chapter 14 is the feeding of the 5,000. It says in verse 13, "Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself." So this was very common for Jesus to do. He was very much into having quiet time with his Father. You would think Jesus, who has 3.5 years to basically begin a movement that would change human history forever, you would think he'd be like, you know what, I can skip my prayer time today. I don't need to go in a secluded place today. I need to be busy. But here, hearing about John the Baptist, maybe feeling grief over the loss of his cousin. John the Baptist was a relative of his. And even this fellow minister, he feels sorrow. And he goes back and he withdraws to himself. And that's something that we need to do as well, to find time with the Lord, quiet time. In the busy hustle of this world and the craziness and everything that's gone on in 2020, the world's been in kind of chaos. And it's very easy for us to get caught up in that. Get caught up in the social media and the news and keeping up with these facts and those things. And we do need to be informed. I do believe that. I do think we need to know what's going on. But oftentimes that can swallow up our minds and our hearts and our thoughts and our emotions, and our lives become about current events. There's a time in which we need to step away and just step back and say, you know what, I'm going to put aside all that for a moment. I'm going to not consider those things so much right now, and I'm just going to open my heart to the Father and withdraw away with the Father. Go for a walk, go into your inner room, sit out on the porch, whatever you got to do, go on vacation, so that you can refocus and recenter yourself on the Father. Jesus did that in the midst of tragedy, and I think we could do it as well. However, notice how the story continues. Even though he's seeking this withdrawal and this seclusion and this quietness with his Father, he doesn't necessarily get it as much as he probably would have, because the people hear about it. As you continue to read verse 13, "And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them and healed their sick." So here Jesus is going to withdraw himself, to be secluded. But then this large crowd hears about where he's at, and they come to him. And instead of saying, "Oh, you're ruining my quiet time. Oh, I can't believe, I wanted to withdraw, and now you guys messed it up. I tell you what, why don't you guys just kind of hang out here for a little while? I got to go spend some time with the Lord." He didn't do that. As they came to him, he felt compassion. And so what we find is with Christ, his compassion superseded his sorrow and his own cares for himself. Sometimes when we feel sorrow, we can become self-absorbed, self-focused, and all we want to do is work on ourselves, finding healing within ourselves, trying to somehow comfort ourselves, and we can become very me-focused when we come against tragedy. But something magical, well, not literally magical, but something interesting happens when we don't do that, when we don't turn inward, when we actually turn outward, and we begin to have compassion on other people, and we turn perhaps our sorrow into loving others and doing good works and becoming other-focused and not so much me-focused. It actually lends itself to bringing some healing to us. Because when we just focus on our own darkness and all the things that we're going through, it just can lead us into deeper depression. But when we focus on other people's needs and other people's desires, it can change our focus and help us to think outside of ourselves. Jesus did this. He gives us an example of that. He says that he healed their sick. Then in verse 15, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." So the disciples see a problem. These people had come out. They're in a desolate place. They're out in this desert region where there's not a McDonald's down the road. There's nowhere to eat. And so what do? They bring it to Jesus. Hey, the people are starving. They need something to eat. It's getting late. Let's give them something to eat. And again, we see an example of what we should do. Sometimes we see needs out in the world. We see people who are hungry. Maybe we see people who are hurting. We may see people who have been abused. We might see people who have been through all types of problems and trials in life. And we need to bring that to Jesus. Bring it to him and say, "Lord, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm hearing about." And just bring it to him. God, these people are out in a desert place. They have nothing to eat. And there's nowhere to send them to get something to eat. Or can we send them to give them something to eat? Trying to find a solution, but bringing it to the Lord. That's a great example of something that we should do. But it's interesting how Jesus answers them in verse 16. "But Jesus said to them, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.'" Oftentimes, or at least sometimes, when we come to the Lord and we see a problem, we see a tragedy, or we see a situation where people are being misused or abused or something along those lines, and we bring it to the Lord and we say, "Lord, give them something to eat, or give them a solution to their problems. Bring somebody into the world, into their lives that can help them. Get them into contact with the right organization that can lead them through that tragedy." And as we're praying about it, we just get this feeling in our heart that the Lord is saying, "You know what, Joey? You go and take care of the problem. You be my instrument in a way in which I can touch their lives and change their lives." Oftentimes, we want to bring it to the Lord in prayer. "Lord, send somebody else to go do it. Go fix the problem, and then I'm going to go back and take care of my life." When all the while, Jesus is saying, "No, you need to roll up your sleeves, and you go do something about it. You pick up the baton and help out in this situation." Well, we might have the response that the disciples had in verse 17. They said to him, "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fishes." We might respond like that as well. When the Lord says, "No, you go out and help," we might say, how can I help? It's such a big problem. This is so much bigger than me. I don't have the resources. I don't have the ability, the gifts, or the talents to help in this particular situation. Lord, all I have are, what did they say? 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's all I have. I don't have anything to offer, Lord. You're asking me to go and feed these people, but I don't have the resources. Again, listen to what he says. In verse 18, "And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' And then ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food, breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied." So here, Jesus recognized, you don't have the resources. I'll be your resource. I'll be the means by which you can feed these people. Just bring me the little bit that you have. Bring me those 5 loaves and 2 fish. Bring me that little bit of talent that you have, or that little bit of amount of resources that you have. Bring it at my feet. Bring it to me, and see if I don't do something wonderful with it. And be able to allow that to make a powerful impact on the people that you are concerned with. Be able to bring what little you have to Jesus, and he can turn it into something great. We see this even in our gifts and talents that God gives us. We all are gifted in some way to help with the kingdom, with helping other people. And oftentimes that gift starts very small. But the more and more we exercise it, the more and more we trust Christ, and we go out and we take ourselves on a limb and exercise our gifts, the more and more that gift grows, and the more fruit we can bear. And he can take such a little amount and produce great fruit through us, if we'll just take him by faith. That's what the disciples did. And it ended up feeding 5,000 people. Which is amazing to me, because it's not so much true anymore, but I used to be able to use this analogy, but I'll still use it. But a few years ago, there used to be a good 5,000 people easy that worked at CCAD on the base where I worked. And to think about the fact that everybody that worked in that organization could be fed by such a small amount of food. It would be equivalent to me saying, you know what? All of CCAD is hungry today. I'm going to go to Whataburger, get a couple of number one combos, and I'm going to feed the whole base with just that amount. This is an amazing miracle, a powerful miracle that Jesus performed. To be able to do this, to be able to take such a small resource and feed so many people. So what this shows us is that Christ has the means to satisfy our lives. Look what it said in verse 20. And they all ate and were satisfied. Christ is our full satisfaction. When we come to him empty, hungry, thirsty, what happens? He comes to our lives and he satisfies us. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. I can bring to you your desires, the things that you're empty about, your shortcomings, your faults. I can come in, Jesus would say, and I can bring you full satisfaction. I can bring transformation into your life and bring you the spiritual life that you crave and help you to cultivate that and to live in that. So this physical sustenance that he gives points us to the spiritual sustenance that Christ can bring us through his work in our lives. It says they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets. So they had 12 baskets left. Why were there 12 baskets? Well, it has been suggested there were 12 apostles. So after they took by faith what Jesus said, you give them something to eat. After they took the little bit that they have and they dispersed it to the people and everybody ate and was satisfied, guess what? There was enough for them as well. And that's what we find as well. When we go by faith, go with the little bit that we have, the little resources that we have, trust in Jesus that he can make that into something great. And we go out and we do his work, even though we don't really know how it's all going to work out. At the end of the day, when it's all said and done, we find we have our basket full as well. We are fully satisfied after trusting in him, after working for him, after seeing his great power working through us to the satisfaction of other people. We ourselves become satisfied. Our baskets become full. So each of the disciples, you can see them walking off with their basket, having just seen a great miracle by Jesus. And then them too being able to participate in that and being satisfied by the satisfaction that Christ would bring. And then it says in verse 21, there are about 5,000 men who ate, besides women and children. So I've been saying 5,000, but there could have been a good 10,000 once you include the women and the children as well. This was common back then in ancient biographies and things. Whenever you talk about a crowd, typically just mention the men. And Matthew is just falling in suit with that. Then we get to another miracle by Jesus after this. So in verse 22, it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. So after all this takes place, he tells them to get in a boat and to go to the other side. The other side of the sea is what he's implying here. And then while they're doing that, he's going to send the crowds away. Jesus is going to get his quiet time. Matter of fact, in verse 23 it says, after he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. So he sacrificed a little bit of quiet time to have compassion on these crowds, to help them, even to feed them, heal them. And then after that was taken care of, he still didn't say, well, there goes my quiet time. He still found time to be by himself, to find time to pray. But he does this by sending the crowds away, and also by sending his disciples to the other side of the sea. Now this is where what we talked about last week becomes important. Remember we talked about the dragnet that was cast into the sea, caught all different types of fishes, and then once all the fishes were in, I don't think fishes is actually a word, when all the fish were brought into the boat, then they went through the different fish and threw the bad ones out and kept the good. And it said that the sea, oftentimes in scriptures, is an analogy of the world, right? The world contains all different types of people. And as the gospel is proclaimed, as the dragnet is cast out, all different types of people would be collected. But in the end, it was only those true fish, the clean fish, that would be accepted. Well, here when we talk about the disciples crossing over the sea, we can stick with that analogy. Because we too, like the disciples, are called to go over the sea, to go to the other side of the sea. In other words, for a short time, we must traverse this world. We must live in this world. Christ said to his Father in John chapter 17, they are in the world, but they're not of the world. The disciples would have been in the sea, but not of the sea, and they were to travel to the other side. And we are called to do the same. For this short amount of time, we are to navigate in this world. We are to live in this world. We are to float in the waters of this world. And one day we will make it to the other side. One day we will make it to shore. We will find our firm footing in heaven where we will live for eternity. But we just have this short boat ride we got to take for a little bit. Well, the Sea of Galilee is much like this world as well. You see, on the eastern mountains, there was eastern mountains next to the Sea of Galilee, where the winds would come over the mountains, that cold air would come out over the mountains, and then it would hit the warm air above the sea. And when the warm air and the cold air came together, a storm would be produced very, very quickly, rapidly. You wouldn't be able to read about it on the news 2 days beforehand. It was just going to be coming in unexpectedly. And that's how this world is, isn't it? You're just traveling along. I'm in my boat. I'm traveling on the waters. I'm just trying to get to the other side. Everything is calm and good. And then, boom, out of nowhere, you're blindsided by a storm. Next thing you know, you're in the midst of chaos. You're in the midst of danger and hardship and trials. And you're like, how did this happen so fast? Just yesterday I was having a good day, and now I'm in the midst of tragedy. This is what happened to the disciples as we continue to read the story. Verse 24 says, "But the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary." So the wind is blowing, the waves are rolling. They're having a very difficult time navigating this boat through these different things. And the wind can symbolize the spiritual forces that come against us. The waves can symbolize the actual circumstances and situations that come at us that are empowered by the spiritual forces behind it. Remember Ephesians chapter 6, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the forces of darkness in the heavenly places. There are forces that cause the circumstances that come at us, just like the wind would cause its ferocious waves to come at them. Oftentimes we find ourselves in similar situations, being battered by the waves, battered by the trials of this world. But in verse 24, "And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid.'" Interesting. The disciples, the whole time they're in the battered waves, they're in their boat trying to get to the other side as Jesus told them to, and they're having this difficult situation. It's interesting that unbeknownst to them, Jesus was there. Jesus was there in the chaos. Jesus was there in the storm, in the difficulty, and they weren't aware of it. Oftentimes in our lives, we are challenged with things that make us want to cry and bring us consternation and hardship and pressure on our lives. And we may think we're alone in it. We may be battering the boats and just think, yeah, I just got to be stronger. I just got to work harder. I just got to do this. I got to do that. And all the while, Jesus is standing on the water. He's standing in the midst of the chaos. He's standing in the middle of all the things that are going on, the disruption. He's standing there. All we got to do is turn our eyes to him and see him standing there. And when we see him there, he has this message to tell us. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Jesus is there to tell us when you are challenged, when life becomes difficult, when storms blindside you, I'm there. Don't be afraid. I'm close to you in the boat. Well, Peter takes this a step further in verse 28. Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Now here, Peter isn't just saying, "Oh yeah, here's some water, let me walk on it, and it'll be a neat little trick, a neat little miracle that I can tell my friends about later." Think about what he's asking Jesus to do. He's asking Jesus to allow him not only to step on water, but on troubled water, on water in which there were huge amount of waves and the wind blowing even in the midst of all the chaos, Peter said, Lord, I want to walk on the water. I want to be where you are, even if I have to put myself in the place of danger to do it. And do we ourselves desire the presence of Christ in the midst of storms, so much so that we'd be willing to go deeper into the darkness, deeper into the chaos, deeper into the difficulty, knowing that Christ will hold us up, but boy, we'll get to be in his presence, in his direct presence, where he can touch us and comfort us and help us and keep us in the trials. Are we willing to step out in faith, step out of the boat, and know that if I can just reach Jesus, everything's going to be okay? Peter seemed to think that. And he asked the Lord, let me come to you. In verse 29, and he said, come. Jesus would say, any who would come to me, I will in no wise reject. Those who seek my presence, those who are fixing their eyes upon me, even in the midst of chaos, come. I will not turn you away. I will not tell you, no, today is not the day. You come, and you'll find me. You'll find my presence, even in the midst of these situations you find yourself in. And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came towards Jesus. What a step of faith he had. But look what happens in verse 30. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Oftentimes, we start out good. We see the Lord working in our lives, and we're desiring to be with him, but boy, the circumstances, they increase, the difficulties increase, and we begin to look at the things around us, and we begin to sink further and further into the world. Our heavenly thoughts, our Jesus-fixed eyes are cast elsewhere, and we begin to sink. This is a common thing that happens to people of faith. But Jesus has compassion on him. In verse 31, immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now this always amazes me that Jesus said this. Peter, the only one of the 12 that stepped out of the boat, the only one who was willing to go into the chaos, the darkness, the trials, the difficulties to get to Jesus, the one who showed the most faith in getting out of the boat, Jesus says, you of little faith. What this shows us is that, yes, the initial burst of faith that you have, perhaps when you first come to faith in Christ, maybe that little burst of faith that you have when you get engaged in some type of activity in which you trust the Lord, that's valuable, but what he really looks for is a faith that endures, a faith that continues to walk on the water, a faith that continues to fix its eyes on him, a faith that doesn't give up, a faith that doesn't look around and begin to sink. He wants, yes, a faith that gets out of the boat, but boy, he wants a faith that takes it all the way to Jesus. And that's what he wants out of us. That's what he desires. And so when Peter didn't make it all the way to him, that's why he says, you of little faith. How many times, I wonder in my life, has Jesus looked on me and said, oh, you of little faith, look at you sinking, and all you have to do is fix your eyes on me, and everything's going to be okay. It can happen to all of us. In verse 32, it says, when they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, you are certainly God's Son. So when we seek his presence, when we seek him, and we're even willing to walk on the stormy waters to get to him, what we'll find is suddenly he's in the boat with us, and calm surrounds us. Maybe not in our environment necessarily, but maybe in our hearts, where the storm was raging, where the difficulty and trial was really inwardly. We seek him, we fix our eyes on him, suddenly he's in the boat, he comes into us, and he brings the comfort that he can bring. And he whispers to our heart, peace be still. And we are still before him. Then in verse 34, when they had crossed over, so they made it over, they came to the land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent word into all that surrounding district and brought to him all who were sick. And they implored him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak, and as many as touched it were cured. The place in which we are headed, the land that we are seeking for, the place we are crossing over to is, metaphorically, Gennesaret. It's going to be the place in which we will find healing. When we find the other side of this world, all the adversity and trials, we're going to go to a place of healing, a place where Jesus will heal the hearts of all the wounded, of all the sick of this world. In the new heavens and the new earth that he will create for us, we'll just be able to dwell with him forever. The river of life flowing through it, the tree of life in which we can eat from it, the healing of the nations, as the book of Revelation calls it. Where we are heading is a place of healing. But you know what, right now, we got to get through the Sea of Galilee. We got to traverse it, we got to make it through the storms, but one day we know Jesus will be in the boat, we'll be on the shore, and then we'll be good to go. We'll find firm footing for eternity there with God, in which healing will take place, all sorrow will be taken away, and we'll be able to live in him with bliss forever. So that's Matthew chapter 14. Hopefully you found some encouragement from it as I did. I want to open up the invitation to anyone who perhaps wants to go out on the sea with Jesus, who wants to begin their life with Jesus. We talked about how heavy guilt can be on our hearts. And sometimes when we think about the things that we've done in the past, we feel very guilty. We know we did something wrong. Well, Jesus is there to release our burdens and to help us be relieved of that guilt that is placed upon us. But not only that, he takes it a step further. He removes our guilt, and then he brings satisfaction to our hearts. He brings in the full satisfaction that only he can bring. And not only that, he takes it another step forward, and he promises to be with us in the storms and the trials that might come after we place our faith in him. So we find him as our means of being relief of guilt, our full satisfaction, and also our help in time of need. Can't get much better than that. If you want to participate in that, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that JT has prepared.